Chapter 3. It was 7 o'clock in the morning, and I felt as if I hadn't slept at all. I could hear Ted moving around in the kitchen. Never in my life had I brought a man home from a bar. Was this what city life was all about? My head throbbed as I got out of bed, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, and staggered into the living room. Ted was coming out of the kitchen with a cup of coffee for me. Oh God, I hadn't remembered how gorgeous he was. He didn't look as if he'd slept in his clothes. He put his finger to his lips and pointed to the sleeping Tina. He didn't need to shush me because I couldn't think of a thing to say. "How do you feel?" he whispered as we headed back to the bedroom. "Awful, incredibly awful." I fumbled in my purse for aspirin. "You'll feel better after you eat," he said. "If it's all right with you, I'll scramble some eggs and make some toast." I'm not a breakfast person, really. The idea of food made me sick. "I've already started," he confessed. I took a fast shower, put on fresh clothes, and joined him at the table. Tina would be awake soon, and I needed to be together when I introduced her to this man that I didn't even know. I had no idea how to behave. Tina and I had planned to go for a ferry ride across Puget Sound. Ted hinted that he'd like to come along, but I ignored the hint and offered to drop him off at his house in University District. Too much was happening, too fast. When the ferry whistle blew, I thought my head would split. I couldn't look at the water slipping past beneath us without getting dizzy. Tina pressed her face to the window while I sat clutching a cup of coffee. I had really blown it. Picking up men in bars was not my style, yet I had taken Ted home without a second thought after knowing him for 2 or 3 hours. I wondered about him. He acted as though it wasn't an out-of-the-ordinary experience for him, yet he seemed so classy above that sort of encounter. What would he think of me? What sort of mother would take a strange man home in front of her child? 2 hours' worth of Puget Sound scenery was lost on me. By the time the boat eased into the Seattle dock, I had decided that I never wanted to see Ted again. I hoped that the memory of last night would somehow disappear. Ted called that night as cheerful as he'd been in the morning. He wanted to know how we enjoyed the ferry ride and joked about how drunk I'd been and my terrible hangover. But I was distant, still humiliated, and we chatted only a few minutes. Monday came and I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I was really attracted to this man, not just a little, but I wished I had met him differently. Tuesday, someone from the university personnel office called my office to verify that I was working there. It seemed a little odd at the time. As I left work and headed for my car, I looked up to see Ted coming towards me across the parking lot. "Well, hello," I blurted out. "I was just thinking about you." I blushed and felt ridiculous. I hadn't thought about much else for the last 3 days. We fell into talking as easily as we had at the tavern. We agreed on dinner at my place. He suggested steaks and wine, and I tossed him the car keys. We went to a supermarket I hadn't discovered before. It was huge and spotlessly clean, with wide aisles and no long lines at the cash registers. I learned later that it was the classiest supermarket in town. The mom-and-pop store near my apartment was a grimy little place that did most of its business in Thunderbird. Ted knew a lot about food and wine. He chose the steaks, a loaf of French bread, salad greens, then took me across the street to a wine store. "This should be good," he said, taking a bottle of French red wine off the shelf. I was impressed by any wine that had a cork in the bottle. We collected Tina from the daycare and went home to cook. I was impressed with Ted's skill in the kitchen. He had left it spotless after Sunday's breakfast, and now he took command. "You wouldn't happen to have any fresh garlic, would you?" he asked. "Oh, sure," I said, and got it out of the cupboard. At last, I thought to myself happily, I finally did something right. I put the bread in the oven and made the salad while we talked nonstop about ourselves, the city, politics, all things people talk about when they are first getting to know each other. Tina was testing the water, demanding a lot of attention. Ted told me he hadn't been around little kids much, but he was charming with her. After dinner, he asked her if she had a favorite book he could read to her. She loved stories, and she ran and got Teddy Bear of Bumpkin Hollow. "Ah, yes," Ted said. "I know this story well. Freddie Bear of Bumpkin Hollow." "No, no," Tina giggled. "It's Teddy Bear of Bumpkin Hollow." "I see," Ted said. "Teddy Bear of Pumpkin Hollow." "Bumpkin," said Tina, and so it went. Tina hanging on Ted's every word, waiting to catch his silly mistakes. We put Tina to sleep in my bed, and we did the dishes and talked about the Northwest. Ted was not from the East Coast as I had assumed, but from Tacoma, a city about 30 miles north of Seattle. He knew the region well and was delighted at how enchanted I was with his native territory. He wanted to show me all his favorite places. When Tina was finally asleep and the bottle of wine was almost empty, he asked me if I would spend the weekend with him in Vancouver, British Columbia. I said yes. He kissed me goodnight and went home, but when we kissed it was clear that we both wanted more. I called Angie with the good news. I tried to maintain a little bit of cool. I didn't want to set myself up for a big fall, but it is hard to be cool when you're wearing an ear-to-ear grin. Angie would be away, but she said I could leave Tina with her roommates. Friday morning, Ted came to take us to work and daycare so he could take the car to the gas station to fill it up and check the tires, the oil, and whatever else. In a corduroy sports coat and tie, he looked like a young man going off to a law office to research an important case. The day flew by. I was excited, but I was also scared. Would I be nervous and tongue-tied during the 3-hour drive? I needn't have worried. He talked about growing up in Tacoma, becoming a Boy Scout, and selling American flags door to door. He said that when he owned a house, he was going to put a flagpole out in front and fly the American flag every day, not just on holidays. I didn't know if he was serious or not. We talked about Vietnam. My brother had been there, and I had been afraid he was going to die there. I didn't think America belonged in Vietnam. Ted and I agreed that the overkill, the use of napalm and bombs, made it plain that we were out to destroy Vietnam rather than save it. Ted told me that he had not been drafted because he was 4F. He had broken his ankle when he was back east and it hadn't healed right. But the draft board in Tacoma didn't think a broken ankle should keep a young man out of the service, so he was having a running battle with them. We arrived in Vancouver about 7:30. It was almost as beautiful as Seattle at night. Ted had wanted to stay at the Hotel Vancouver, an elegant old hotel in the heart of the city, but he found that they didn't have any rooms, so we drove down the block to the Devonshire. I stayed in the car when he went in, wondering how he was going to register. Mr. and Mrs. T.R. Bundy had a nice ring to it. We walked back to the Hotel Vancouver for dinner in a huge, high-ceiling, ornate restaurant with enormous chandeliers. I was awed. Afterwards, we went dancing at Oil Can Henry's, a lively place with go-go dancers and a peculiar mix of hippies, straight young people, and older businessman types. We danced some, but mostly we sat at the table drinking scotch and water and taking the whole scene in. The music was so loud we had to yell over it. It was also hot and crowded. Soon, Ted leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Let's go." The cool air outside felt good. Ted turned to me, put both arms around me, and gave me a long, long kiss. "I have been waiting to do this since I met you 6 years ago," he said. Or was it just 6 days ago? He kissed me again. We were oblivious to the people detouring around us on the sidewalk. "If we keep this up," he said, "we will have to call an aid car to take us back to the hotel." We got back to the hotel, walking home and kissing a lot. As we walked through the lobby, we tried to look calm. Heaven forbid that the desk clerk or bell captain should know what we were about to do. But as we got into the elevator, I began to get cold feet. Did I really want this gorgeous guy to see my body with its stretch marks, small breasts, and the extra 5 pounds I'd been carrying around since Tina was born? Ted apparently felt no hesitation, nor did he sense mine. In our room, he put his arms around me and began kissing me. Then the chemistry took over. We made love as though this would be the last time we would ever see each other, as if we were trying to get enough of each other to last a lifetime. I felt good next to him. He ran his fingertips over my back. I wondered if he enjoyed our lovemaking as much as I did. I had made love with 2 other men besides my husband, both after my divorce. For different reasons, neither time had been satisfying. This was different. We made love again and finally fell asleep about 4 in the morning. We lingered over breakfast in our room, sitting by the window, looking out on the street and the large fountain below. We talked more about ourselves and my life in Utah and Ted's future as a lawyer. I told him about my high school sweetheart. He told me about an old flame named Susan. He met her while living in a University of Washington dormitory. She was slender, pretty, intelligent, from a wealthy San Francisco family. She eventually went back home. Ted had followed her there and enrolled in a summer course in Chinese at Stanford, but he said they had drifted apart. She had a life of her own apart from him, and he seemed to feel it was her wealth that shut him out. That surprised me. He was always so well dressed, and he seemed so at ease in these luxurious surroundings. Finally, we went out to look at the city. Vancouver was even more cosmopolitan than Seattle. We roamed through the large Chinatown, up through a German neighborhood, and past quaint tea shops. We walked with our arms around each other, moving together in a perfect rhythm. I was lightheaded. The drive back to Seattle Saturday afternoon was filled with unending conversation. We covered religion. Neither of us was an active churchgoer. Drugs. Neither of us smoked dope. TV. Neither of us had any use for it. We still had so much to cover, and we didn't want to part. We stopped in Seattle and bought food for dinner before we picked up Tina. She had a lot to tell us and pictures she had drawn to show us. Ted had brought some Canadian candy back for her. After we got Tina to bed, we settled down for more wine and conversation. Ted liked what he called my small-town perspective. He thought it was less cynical than most city people's. He laughed when I talked about how painful my shyness was and how my neck and face got covered with red blotches. We made love. "Do you want me to go home?" he asked. I had mixed feelings about that. It was wonderful to lie next to him, but after my divorce, I had often told myself that I would never subject Tina to a string of male overnight guests. I had to teach by example, not words. On the other hand, I really wanted him to stay. "Maybe if we got dressed before she got up," I said. We left the matter dangling as we drifted off to sleep. On Sunday, Ted showed Tina and me his room in the University District. In an immaculately kept old rooming house owned by an elderly German couple, Ernst and Freda, Ted had a big corner room on the second floor with enormous windows and a high ceiling. The hardwood floors were covered with an old dusty pink patterned carpet. Everything was orderly and spotless. A starched doily lay across the top of his dresser. Ted introduced me to his roommate, a Boston fern that sat in the corner where the windows met. He called the plant Fern and fussed over it. He had a small stereo that he kept tuned to Seattle's classical music station. The whole place had an airy charm that reminded me of houses that I'd seen on a trip to Europe when I was in high school. I thought it suited him perfectly. Soon we began spending most of our time together. He had a temporary job with a messenger firm that delivered legal papers. I thought he had told me he was a law student the night we met, but in fact he was waiting to start law school the next quarter. I was amazed and pleased at how much Ted liked our domestic scene. He seemed hungry for family life. He took Tina and me out to all of his favorite places: the public market, the main street of the University District called the Ave, where we browsed through the used book and record stores, the International District, where we ate Chinese food and Ted tried out his limited Chinese on the patient waiters. We made love every chance we got. I had never felt this close to any man before. I had resolved, I told him, that I would never get involved with another student. I wanted to be with someone more established, someone who could support me while I raised the kids. And yet the thought of losing you, of not being with you— "I know," he said. "I feel the same way, but it's as if we know each other, as if we've known each other before in some former life. We fit together so well in so many ways. We fill in all the gaps for each other. I look back on my life before I met you, and it seems it was terribly empty. I love you more than you know." We did fit well together. I believed that the man should be the leader in a relationship, and Ted liked to lead. I liked his protectiveness of me and Tina, both emotionally and physically. I was naive about what goes on in the city, and sometimes I took unnecessary risks. One night when Ted came over after dinner, I told him that Tina and I had stopped at Volunteer Park on the way home from work to swing, and that we'd had the park practically to ourselves. He was horrified. "Don't you realize how isolated you are there in case of trouble?" "Trouble? What kind of trouble?" "You name it, and you can probably find it in Volunteer Park, especially at dusk. If you want to play in a park, come get me first. You understand?" I nodded sheepishly. I hadn't used my head. Chapter 4. I liked my job, but the 8 to 5 grind wore me down, and when I got tired, I would get short-tempered with Tina. Then I would feel guilty about the kind of mother I was, and then a homesick feeling would get set in. Ted helped protect me from the whip lady who lived inside me, who was always telling me I should be a better mother, should work harder, should have more energy. He believed I was doing okay with Tina and my job. His opinion meant a lot to me. I had long since confessed to him that I was a secretary, but he liked to hear about my job and told me he thought my work was important. My story about making heart valves had become a joke between us. Every Sunday night, Ted would say, "Well, you better get to sleep early so you'll be rested up for making those heart valves tomorrow." Talking and eating and taking care of Tina and sleeping together all flowed along so effortlessly that we had become a family. Ted planned special outings that he knew would be fun for Tina, trips to Green Lake to feed bread to the ducks or visits to the zoo. As we walked along, Tina would grab both of our hands and shout, "Swing me, swing me." I seemed to get tired of this much quicker than Ted or Tina, but when I wouldn't play anymore, they didn't care. Ted would swing her by an arm and a leg until they were both dizzy. At home, the two of them would get into tickle fights on the floor. Tina would holler, "Save me, Mom, save me," and then we'd all roll around on the floor laughing and tickling until someone, usually me, would call for a truce. On Saturday mornings, Tina and Ted would watch cartoons together and let me sleep in. Their favorite was Dudley Do-Right and the Mounties. Dudley had a girlfriend named Nell whom he saved from villains who routinely tied her to railroad tracks. Ted could mimic Dudley perfectly, and he would call Tina Nell. Together, Dudley and Nell would fix breakfast and bring it to me in bed. One weeknight in November, Ted took us to dinner at his parents' house in Tacoma. He had told me that Tacoma was a boring, ugly town. I didn't think it looked bad, but the smell got to me, a smell of rotten eggs that I first noticed 10 full miles north of town. Ted said it came from a pulp mill and was known locally as the Tacoma aroma. I was nervous about meeting Ted's folks. I was sure that being divorced and having a child were 2 strikes against me, and I expected them to be wealthy. But they lived in a warm and homey 2-story colonial house to which they had recently moved. Ted had grown up in a house that he hated because his room in the basement had never been furnished and it embarrassed him to bring friends home, he said. I met his 4 younger brothers and sisters who all still lived at home, and I hit it off with his father. Johnny Bundy was a cook at an army hospital. He was from the Ozarks, and he was full of long stories about scrambling eggs for 500 people and about cars that broke down. He talked a blue streak and a southern accent, and I was happy to listen. He was open and friendly, and he made me feel welcome. Louise, Ted's mother, was a secretary at their Methodist church. She was friendly too, but in a more formal way. Ted assured me on the way home that they had liked Tina and me. As much as they liked Susan, I asked. The memory of his slender, pretty, intelligent, wealthy ex-girlfriend was still with me. "They probably liked you more," he said, laughing. I realized now that my family was actually more affluent than Ted's. His finances were the same as most of the students I knew. He was broke most of the time. Not long after our deluxe weekend in Vancouver, Ted took me to dinner at an expensive restaurant overlooking Puget Sound. Later, he confessed that he had spent his last dollar on the meal and that we would have had to wash dishes if I had ordered another drink. We laughed about it, and I was all the more flattered that he had taken me there. Even on the night we met in the Sandpiper Tavern, he finally confessed the reason he was sitting at the table looking so dejected was that he had run out of money for beer. Yet none of us doubted that wealth was in Ted's future. He was marked for success. I was perfectly happy to go places with him in my car, to pay for the gas and to pay for the food he ate at my house. I was sure it would all even out eventually. Tina and I were planning to fly home to Utah to spend Christmas with my folks. A couple of Angie's friends were driving to Utah for the holidays, and it didn't take much to persuade Ted to go with them. They had trouble getting through the snowbound mountain passes, and when they pulled up at my parents' house late on Christmas Eve, Mom and Dad had gone to bed. It was cold and clear, and the ground was covered with snow. Ted couldn't believe how clear the sky was and how many stars there were. I showed him my old bedroom where Tina and I would be sleeping and the guest room where he would sleep. We snickered about what saints we were pretending to be. I wouldn't dream of telling my parents about our sleeping arrangements in Seattle. When Ted met my parents in the morning, he liked them and they liked him. He talked about politics and football with my dad. I always thought of my dad as quiet and reserved, but he and Ted talked on for hours. My mom never lets anyone help in the kitchen, so Ted didn't ask to help. He just did. She loves to tell jokes, and Ted was the perfect audience. The two of them laughed and cooked Christmas dinner together and kept the rest of us out of the kitchen. Later, we all went out together to visit family friends, and Ted seemed to fit in wherever he went. It was a relief to me to be with him and let him carry the conversation. Late in the day, he called his family in Tacoma to wish them a Merry Christmas. My folks were pleased with Ted, my mother's only criticisms being that she thought he was too hard on Tina. But she was a grandmother, and even I thought she spoiled Tina sometimes. Mom and Dad wanted to keep Tina for an extra week, and she couldn't have been more excited. Ted drove back with Angie's friends, and the next day I flew back to Seattle alone to find the dreariest of gray winter rain. But Ted came over that night, and the weather didn't matter at all. Ted and I had a week alone to spend any way we wanted. For the first time, we could spend nights at his place. I liked being there, surrounded by his things. I laughed at the styrofoam imitation straw souvenir hat he kept from the 1968 Rockefeller campaign, but Ted was proud of it. He had gone to the Republican convention in Miami to support Rockefeller. All the hoopla might look silly from the outside, he said, but he found himself caught up in the excitement of the convention. Conservative as he was, Ted was sympathetic to some of the student demonstrations on campus. He was against the war in Vietnam and critical of the university as an institution. The campus was in constant turmoil in those days. Ted came to my office one day, out of breath, to tell me that Thompson Hall had been occupied by protesters who alleged that the building was the center of CIA activity on campus. We went out to watch. The police had put up barricades across the street, and the whole scene was unreal, like a movie set. They haven't trashed anything, Ted said. They pulled it off. They've got the building, and it was completely nonviolent. This was a long way from Ogden. I didn't even know what trashed meant. But as sophisticated as Ted was, he had one hang-up that surprised me. Not long after we started spending time together, he came over one night and said he had something very important to tell me, something that might change my opinion of him. Shaking with nervousness, he told me that he was illegitimate. His mother gave birth to him in a home for unwed mothers in the East, he said, and they moved to Tacoma to live with relatives while he was very small. Then she married Johnny Bundy and had 4 more children. Johnny Bundy had adopted him, but Ted knew nothing about it until he was a teenager. It had come as a terrible shock. A cousin had been teasing him about it, and Ted had refused to believe it. The cousin had taken Ted up to the attic and showed him proof, his birth certificate. Ted was upset by his cousin's cruelty and furious with his mother because she left him unprepared for humiliation at the hands of his cousin. She never even had the decency to tell me herself, he said bitterly. He asked if I thought he should confront his mother about it. I told him no. I could sympathize with her. She had made a mistake when she was young, as I had, but had overcome it and had gone on to make a life for herself. It could not have been easy that many years ago, harder, I was sure, than it was for me when I was pregnant with Tina. I'm sure it's a source of a lot of pain for her, I said, and that's probably why she didn't talk about it. It's not important anymore. What's important is that you've got a lot going for you. I love you because you're wonderful. Ted put his head in his hands and cried. It bothered him that his family was middle class. He was ambitious and wanted to be better than that. He liked the fact that my father was a successful dentist, but to me at least his family status didn't seem to be a major problem. Ted was very fond of them, and success would be all the more satisfying to him if he made it on his own. Our more immediate concern was apartment hunting. Ted thought my apartment was unsafe, bad for Tina, and way too small, and he was right on all counts. He helped me look, and in January 1970, for not much more than I was already paying, we found a wonderful duplex in North Seattle near Green Lake and its surrounding park. It had all the luxuries I had been missing. A lawn for Tina to play on, a washer and dryer, a second bedroom, big closets, and a kitchen you could turn around in. Ted negotiated with my old landlord and got my deposit returned, even though I had not stayed for the 6 months minimum I had agreed to. The Green Lake place was like heaven. As the weather got warmer, we carried our table outside for dinner once in a while, and Ted would pick flowers for the table and light candles in the dusk. We fell into a new routine. Ted kept his room in the university district, but he spent most nights with us. He drove Tina to daycare and me to work every morning and kept the car during the day. The closet filled up with his clothes. I had never been so happy, but it bothered me to be practically living with a man I wasn't married to. I wasn't sure anymore what Tina understood, but when we went places together, people often assumed that Ted was her father. Ted and I had been talking about our future together almost since we met. How when we were rich, we would drive a Mercedes and buy a beach place on Puget Sound. We talked about when we were married, but we never actually talked about getting married. I figured now was the time. We were playing house and enjoying it. Why not make it legal and honest? I didn't like not being able to be open with my parents about the exact nature of my relationship with Ted, and I felt that it wasn't fair to Tina to have this man around who wasn't really her dad. There wasn't even a word for what he was in relation to us. When I talked about him to others, I never knew what to call him. Boyfriend seemed to be too high school. Lover was true, but definitely not socially acceptable. I wanted to be able to refer to my husband, Ted. When I talked with him about it, he agreed that now was the time to do it. If he was reluctant in any way, he didn't show it. One day in February, I took time off from work to get the license, and Angie met us at the courthouse on her lunch hour to be our witness. She also loaned us $5 for the license. I wrote to my parents and told them the good news. They were very pleased. Ted held off telling his parents. Then one Sunday we went to Tacoma for dinner. It was a happy day, but dinner passed without a word about our plans from Ted. About 5 o'clock, when it was almost time to head back for Seattle, he and his mom disappeared. I knew he must be discussing our marriage plans with her and wondered why I wasn't included. When they came back in, Mrs. Bundy gave me a hug and said she wished happiness for us, but I had the feeling that she didn't believe I was good enough for Ted. On the ride home, Ted told me she thought we should wait until he graduated. I thought that was stupid. If we got married now, I could help put Ted through law school. I liked the idea of working toward a goal together. A few days later, at Northgate Shopping Center, we passed a jewelry store. "Let's go in and look at rings," I suggested. "What's the point in looking?" he said. "We can't afford anything but a plain band. Hell, we probably can't even afford that." "It doesn't hurt to dream," I said. We went inside the store, but he looked at watch bands while I looked at rings. When a salesperson came over, Ted wouldn't say anything. I was getting angry, and he was acting so nervous that I was afraid the jeweler might think we were casing the place. "Let's go," I said, trying to control my voice. When we were outside, I said, "Let's stop at the liquor store and get some scotch. I could use a drink." I was scared. I wanted desperately for things to work out as I planned. A few days later, Ted and I were walking from my office to the parking lot. My parents were coming soon for a visit, and I hoped we would get married while they were there. I told Ted that we should move his clothes out of my closet before they came, because I didn't want them to know that we were practically living together. Ted thought that was childish. "You're a grown woman, Liz. You have a daughter of your own and a life of your own. For God's sake, grow up." When we got to the car, he put his briefcase on the hood, opened the case, took out the marriage license, and said, "If you're that hung up on what your parents think, then you're not ready to get married. Let's forget the whole thing." He tore the license up in little pieces and threw them on the ground. Then he turned and walked away. I stared at his back, not believing what had happened. I looked at the pieces of the marriage license on the ground as if they were vomit, sick of myself for pushing and pushing until I had pushed the man I loved right out of my life. I stopped at the liquor store before I picked Tina up, agonizing because everything I did turned to worms. I tried to get Tina fed and into bed without her knowing how upset I was. She wanted to know where Ted was. Busy was all I could get out. After she was asleep, I poured myself a drink and sat down to figure out what had happened and what the next step was. I called Angie and unloaded on her. "Just because Ted doesn't want to get married doesn't mean he doesn't love you," she said. "The important thing is that you guys are happy together. Who is getting married these days anyway? When he's ready, he'll marry you." Angie's words and the scotch made me feel better. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard Ted's key in the lock. I was ashamed that my face was all swollen from crying. I didn't want him to know how important marriage was to me. If I could be casual about it and act as if it was no big deal, maybe I wouldn't drive him away. He came into the bedroom and put his arms around me. "I don't want to sleep alone tonight," he said, and kissed me on the forehead. I really do love you.